Welcome back to the Open Ground. This is the first video in our Masculine Axis playlist, and I am really excited to begin this section of the overall infrastructure I am attempting to build. The gender war cannot be won. Masculinity, misalignment, and the Black Dyad in collapse. To see the irrational and still indulge it for lustful comfort is to forfeit the role of leader. Masculinity demands more than awareness. It demands restraint. Perpetual philosophy. Introduction. The systemic design of gender warfare. There is no victory in the current gender war. That truth becomes clear the more one attempts to fight it on its terms, through posture, rebuttal, and performance. The war itself is the structure, and participation is defeat. At the macro level, this war was not born from the failures of intimacy, but from the successes of systemic design. The fracture between men and women was not incidental, it was incentivized. The post-industrial West, as theorists from Foucault to Marcuse have shown, began not with the liberation of the individual, but with the management of populations, the fragmentation of communal bonds, and the atomization of identity. When society shifted from relational interdependence to capitalist autonomy, gender solidarity was one of the first casualties. This war has not only been permitted, it has been cultivated. The liberal contract, inherited from Locke and Hobbes, cast the individual as sovereign and competing. The idea of mutual duty between man and woman was replaced by rights arbitration. The Enlightenment fantasy of rational agency was applied unequally, first excluding women entirely, then re-including them only by framing them as adversaries to patriarchal privilege. The war, in other words, was baked into the formula. It was never about reconciliation, it was about control. But when this global template landed in Black America, it collided with a community already operating under siege. As Cornel West notes, we are a hated people, and every ideological experiment applied to us has come with an extra layer of violence, distortion, or abandonment. The Black gender war did not emerge organically. It was exacerbated through economic exclusion, mass incarceration, and the deliberate engineering of dependency and distrust, from the Moynihan Report to welfare conditionalities. Frederick Douglass understood this dynamic over a century ago when he observed that the enslaved man's first violence was not against his oppressor, but against his fellow enslaved, because the system was designed to turn survival instincts inward. What plays out today on social media as memes, videos, and podcast disputes, Black men shaming Black women accusing Black men, is not a petty interpersonal conflict. It is a civil war inside a colony. It is a reaction to existential conditions misframed as preference. The rupture between Black men and Black women represents both our greatest vulnerability and our most profound opportunity for reconstruction. Unlike other communities with inherited wealth, institutional protection, and generational stability, we cannot afford the luxury of gender warfare. Our survival has always depended on relational interdependence, a truth our ancestors understood but which contemporary ideologies have taught us to abandon. We argue about gender while the foundation of the house burns beneath us. This is why we must refuse to inherit the framework. To fight a gender war is to lose the communal one. There is no equilibrium possible if the masculine axis does not reestablish itself. Not as dominator, but as weight-bearer, the one who holds the line even when the world around him breaks rank. This is not sentiment. This is physics. A structure without load-bearing members collapses. As always, we begin from there. Masculinity as universality, manhood as path. There are few words more misunderstood than masculinity. It has been reduced to costume, inflated into caricature, and derailed into tit-for-tat theater, with femininity as though it were its opposite, its rival, its antagonist. But masculinity, properly understood, is not a relational stance. It is not a response to women. It is not emergent from circumstance. It is a universal condition of orientation toward reality itself. Either you are aligned to it or you are not. James Baldwin recognized this distinction when he wrote about the difference between being a ninja and being a man. One was a reactive identity imposed by circumstance. The other was an ontological choice that transcended circumstance. Baldwin understood that true masculine presence could not be proven through opposition or performance, but only through the gravity of sustained authenticity under pressure. This is metaphysics. A man's masculinity is not proved by his volume, his conquest, his reaction to insult. It is proven by his gravity, his capacity to remain intact under pressure, and to act according to what is structurally required, not personally desired. And in the current climate, where men spend entire seasons online, disputing, correcting, debating, and mocking women under the pretense of masculine truth-telling, one must ask, what is this proving? And to whom? Malcolm X demonstrated this principle in his transformation from reactive street hustler to disciplined revolutionary. His early manhood was defined by reaction to racism, to poverty, to disrespect. But his mature masculinity emerged when he stopped reacting to external provocations and began acting from internal principle. He moved from proving his manhood against others to expressing it for his people. A masculine man does not chase equilibrium through validation. He establishes it through orientation. That orientation is not reactive. It does not unnecessarily seek revenge for slights. It does not compete for rhetorical victory. It does not move because it was moved. It moves because it must. It acts because it has assessed the weight and then chosen to bear it. This is the perpetualist axis. Understand responsibility first, context second, action last. The masculine structure precedes the emotional turbulence of the moment. It is not shaped by it. Booker T. Washington embodied this principle when he chose to build Tuskegee rather than spend his energy debating his critics. He understood that masculine presence was demonstrated through construction, not argumentation. While others disputed the terms of Black advancement, Washington quietly created the infrastructure that would outlast the debates. We are not called to win arguments with women. We are called to build the stage upon which future men and women will not need to argue to survive. That is a task that cannot be delegated. That is a weight only we can bear. Masculinity is not a relational constant. Like trust or empathy, it is not up for negotiation in the same way. Its structure remains. Its failure is not that it evolves poorly, it is that men abandon it entirely and mistake reaction for resurrection. Masculinity is a universal vector. It leans toward structure. It aligns toward truth. And it always requires cost. That cost is both beneficial and sacrificial. To be a man is to submit to this paradox without complaint. The benefits of masculinity, respect, order, strength, generativity, are real, but they are inseparable from the sacrifices, loneliness, restraint, tension, and often silence. A man must often speak less, not because he has nothing to say, but because the weight of what he holds demands fewer words and more bearing. It is duty, but duty, unlike preference, is not shaped by mood. Red Pill Reflections: Ideology versus Infrastructure. Ideologies, like tools, are only as useful as the hand and house they serve. A hammer is helpful in construction. It is disastrous in surgery. Yet in recent years, entire communities of men, particularly young Black men, have taken up ideological hammers meant for foreign architecture and swung them wildly at wounds that require delicate healing. The red pill movement, originally conceived as a reactive philosophy to the perceived emasculation of men, in liberal Western culture presents a totalizing framework. Women are hypergamous, society is gynocentric, men must awaken from naivete, reclaim dominance, and refuse emotional compromise. As a reaction to post-feminist chaos, it is emotionally understandable. As a blueprint for the survival and flourishing of black men and women, it is structurally catastrophic. We were warned of precisely this dynamic by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, how oppressed peoples, in their desire for dignity, often adopt the psychological frameworks of their oppressors, not recognizing that these frameworks were never designed for their liberation. Fanon understood that borrowing ideologies without considering their foundational assumptions leads to internal colonization, the reproduction of oppressive dynamics within the oppressed community itself. The critical mistake has not merely been adopting red pill ideas, it has been failing to assess their ideological impact per communal context. Black America is not white suburbia. Our women are not seated in boardrooms of generational wealth. Our families are not protected by institutional buffers. We are a people operating in the aftershock of chattel slavery, economic redlining, mass incarceration, and cultural erasure. In this space, gender disunity is not a personal inconvenience. It is an existential fracture. Thomas Sowell, in his analysis of cultural transmission, has consistently argued that successful communities maintain practices that serve their specific survival needs, regardless of whether those practices align with dominant cultural trends. What works for communities with inherited wealth and institutional protection may be destructive for communities operating under different material conditions. The manosphere did not consider this. It did not ask, what happens when men who have no inherited infrastructure, no communal safety net, no generational capital, internalize a philosophy that tells them to detach, retreat, and dominate? It did not ask, what is lost when men are told to seek leverage instead of connection, strategy instead of sacrifice? To import an ideology built on individualist rebellion into a people who have only survived through relational interdependence is not revolution, it is self-sabotage. W.E.B. Du Bois faced a similar choice in his debate with Booker T. Washington. Du Bois could have adopted the radical individualist frameworks emerging from European thought, focusing on individual rights and personal advancement. Instead, he developed the concept of the talented tenth, recognizing that in communities under siege, individual advancement must be coupled with collective responsibility. Du Bois understood that philosophical frameworks must serve communal survival, not just personal satisfaction. We have to be honest. Some of the philosophies we've adopted, hyper-masculine self-optimization, strategic withdrawal from low-value women, may offer momentary clarity to the individual man, but they do not scale into healing. They do not build. They do not account for children. They do not map onto a future where Black families thrive. Bell Hooks, despite her feminist orientation, understood this dynamic when she wrote about how patriarchal structures harm Black men differently than white men, because Black men lack the institutional power that makes patriarchal dominance functional. When Black men adopt dominant masculine frameworks, without the structural support those frameworks assume, they often end up isolated and ineffective. We don't need to romanticize broken relationships. We don't need to date women we deem hostile or incompatible. I repeat, we do not need to date women we deem hostile or incompatible. But we must understand the difference between individual navigation and collective responsibility. Our current posture toward Black women, marked by sarcasm, critique, refusal, and retaliatory distancing, is not masculine strategy. It is masculine collapse masquerading as control. No community can thrive when its men abandon their post. And no man can lead a future he stopped believing in. Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated the alternative path. In the face of criticism from both black radicals who thought he was too accommodating and white moderates who thought he was too aggressive, King maintained his focus on constructive engagement. He understood that masculine leadership meant holding the center when everyone else was being pulled toward the extremes. We must stop believing that disassociation is strategy, that detachment is safety, that if we make enough podcasts and shout to the heavens about principles, we can insulate ourselves from the messy terrain of partnership and healing. These ideologies do not account for our wounds. They only name our pain and promise superiority in its place. But masculinity is not superiority. It is structure under stress. It is the ability to hold contradiction, to love what is flawed, to build where there is rubble, to endure when trust is thin, and no ideology that tells you to flee the sight of your people's brokenness should be mistaken for wisdom. This is not a plea to be soft. It is a demand to be sovereign. And sovereignty does not flee the battlefield. It contextually redefines the terms of engagement. The weight of the pillar. Masculinity begins where excuse ends. That's the uncomfortable truth. Not because men are exempt from pain, but because masculinity, rightly understood, requires the bearing of pain without transferring it. It is not freedom from burden, it is the consent to carry it. And not just one's own. Frederick Douglass exemplified this principle when he chose to purchase his freedom rather than simply escape. Not because escape was impossible, but because he understood that his individual liberation meant nothing if it left the structure of slavery intact. Douglass bore the weight of representing more than himself, of carrying the dignity of his entire people in his every public appearance. He never had the luxury of being just an individual. He was always a pillar. To be a pillar in any communal structure means you must hold weight not fairly, but disproportionately. You do not merely support yourself, you support what would otherwise collapse. You brace what others lean on. You often hold structures that no longer even know how to honor you. And still, you stand. Because that's what a pillar does. We are not called to be pillars because the world is fair. We are called to do so because the world is not. Marcus Garvey understood this when he built the Universal Negro Improvement Association, not because black people deserved better, though they did, but because someone had to create the infrastructure for dignity. Garvey bore the weight of being called everything from a charlatan to a dreamer. But he continued building because he understood that masculine leadership means creating structure, whether or not you receive credit. There is a lie many men tell themselves today, often coated in ideological varnish. I will give when I see reciprocation. I will carry when someone carries for me. I will show up when I am appreciated. This sounds rational, but it is the language of conditional masculinity, a posture that performs the role of manhood, but only under favorable terms. That is not the masculine principle. That is a negotiation. Medgar Evers could have negotiated. He could have waited for better conditions, more support, clearer guarantees of success. Instead, he chose to organize in Mississippi during the height of Jim Crow, knowing that the work required someone to go first, to bear the initial weight, to create the foundation upon which others could build. Evers understood that pillars don't wait for structural support. They become it. The true masculine orientation, what perpetualism might call the axis of forward being, is not premised on being seen. It is premised on being stable in silence. Masculinity is not always heard, but its absence is always felt. This is not submission. This is not acquiescence. It is sacrificial dignity, the strength to act in alignment with principle, even when the culture around you is hostile. confused, or unready. The masculine pillar does not wait for applause. It does not crumble under misunderstanding. It withstands. John Lewis embodied this principle on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He knew he would be beaten. He knew the cameras might not be rolling. He knew he might not live to see the results of his sacrifice. But he also knew that someone had to bear the physical weight of injustice so that others could cross into freedom. That is pillar work, absorbing impact so that the structure remains intact. And what does the pillar withstand? It withstands the tension between justice and love, between absence and duty, between pain and progress, between the disappointment of others and the refusal to collapse into victimhood, between the desire to be vindicated and the choice to build anyway. Let us be plain. The current masculine culture of online posturing, clickbait confrontation, and endlessly rehashed grievances is not resilience. It is not discipline. It is not structure. It is communal theater in the absence of communal work. Again, communal theater in the absence of communal work. Thurgood Marshall spent decades in courtrooms, often as the only black face in hostile legal environments, building the legal infrastructure that would eventually dismantle segregation. He endured isolation, death threats, and constant professional undermining, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he understood that someone had to bear the legal weight so that future generations wouldn't have to. The future will not be rebuilt by men who can only carry themselves. It will be rebuilt by men who understand that the function of a pillar is not to be admired, but to be leaned on. There is no freedom without structure, and there is no structure without sacrifice. This is what must be relearned. Masculinity is not a feeling to be validated. It is a weight to be carried. And that weight, in a broken and misaligned world, will almost always exceed what feels fair. But fair is not the measure of masculine worth. Stability is. Communal reckoning and philosophical return. We cannot continue like this. This is not simply moral appeal. It is structural diagnosis. No community, no matter how impassioned or intelligent, survives without men who have made peace with the weight of their role. And we are running out of time, not because our enemies are getting stronger, but because our own alignment is thinning. Harold Cruse, in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, identified this precise moment when a community's thinkers become so absorbed in theoretical disputes that they lose sight of practical construction. Cruse warned that intellectual sophistication without communal application leads to brilliant paralysis, the ability to analyze problems without the discipline to solve them. We have misunderstood the source of our strength. Manhood is not a label. It is not a mood. It is not a trait one activates in moments of convenience or spectacle. It is a path, a recursive disciplined return to self under stress, under distortion, under temptation. And too many of us have left the path to spar with ghosts, to lecture women, to tweet from the rubble of what we were called to rebuild. Langston Hughes captured this in his poem, Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? The answer, Hughes suggested, was not just personal frustration, but communal explosion. When men defer their fundamental responsibility to bear weight and build structure, the entire community pays the price of that deferral. Perpetualism reminds us, when all else fails, begin again with self. So let us do that now. Let us assess ourselves, not just socially, but philosophically. Not just emotionally, but contextually. Not merely how we feel, but how we orient. For we have taken on foreign codes, applied them to broken maps, and grown surprised when they yield disconnection. We never ask the question that matters most. What does this do to us, together? Alan Locke, the architect of the Harlem Renaissance, understood that cultural reconstruction required both individual excellence and collective vision. The new Negro was not just a person who had achieved individual success, but someone who carried themselves in a way that elevated the perception and possibilities of the entire community. Locke recognized that personal transformation without communal responsibility was merely sophisticated escapism, because this was never about just you. The war between black men and black women is not romantic conflict. It is a metaphysical collapse at the core of what was supposed to be our continuity. It is not about preference. It is about the conditions under which a people may still become a people. And if our current game plan sacrifices that future for the comfort of present detachment, then we are not strategizing, we are capitulating. Ralph Ellison explored this tension in Invisible Man, the protagonist's journey from reactive identity to intentional presence. Ellison understood that true visibility came not from demanding recognition, but from becoming so aligned with purpose that recognition became irrelevant. The masculine path requires this same transformation, from seeking validation to providing foundation. Yes, have standards and choose wisely. Yes, protect your peace and those who are that for you. But protection is not abandonment of the next generation. Protection is not detachment from the responsibility of pursuing black infrastructure. Protection is a masculine act of boundary and provision. It is a reclamation of sovereignty, not a forfeiture of solidarity. Huey Newton demonstrated this distinction when he organized community self-defense programs that protected black neighborhoods while simultaneously feeding children and providing health care. Newton understood that masculine protection included both boundaries and provision, both the willingness to defend and the commitment to nurture what was being defended. And this requires a deeper masculinity than performance. It requires reconstruction. We must rebuild our relationship to responsibility. We must become men who withstand misunderstanding without becoming inert, who act in accordance with truth even when it means being unseen, who do not need applause to be aligned, who do not trade leadership for attention, who do not abandon the whole because we were wounded in the part. Philip Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters for over a decade before achieving recognition or success. He endured criticism from both black leaders who thought his approach was too radical and white leaders who thought it was too threatening. But Randolph understood that masculine persistence means maintaining orientation, despite social pressure from all directions. To be a pillar is to hold more than your share. To be a man is to endure being misunderstood by those you are trying to protect. To be masculine in this time is to build without immediate reward, knowing the structure may not be completed in your lifetime. But that's the point. Legacy is a weight you never get to see fully lifted. It is the sacrifice you make so others may rise, even if they never know your name. Benjamin Mays, the mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., spent his life building the intellectual and spiritual infrastructure that would produce a generation of leaders. Few remember Mays, but his influence shaped the men who changed the world. Mays understood that true masculine impact often happens in the shadows, in the quiet work of preparation, education, and foundation building. This is where perpetualism lives, in the act of returning, not to a former masculinity, but to an earned one forged in the crucible of contradiction, one that asks not for comfort, but for clarity, one that bears the unbearable, because someone must. Conclusion: the path forward. In my view, men must lead this change, choosing to partner with women who demonstrate symmetry and alliance, and they do exist, to this reconstructive program. However, the children of women who do not align with this vision should not pay the price of their mother's current inability to participate in collective healing. Carter G. Woodson understood this principle when he developed Negro History Week, now Black History Month. Woodson didn't wait for all Black people to appreciate the importance of historical education. He began with those who were ready and created structures that would eventually benefit even those who initially resisted. This is not about punishment or abandonment. It is about strategic alliance building and generational and infrastructural thinking. We build with those who are ready to build. We protect and provide for the next generation, regardless of current alignments. We demonstrate through action rather than argument what masculine reconstruction looks like. The future requires men who understand that individual healing must serve collective restoration, men who can hold the tension between personal boundaries and communal responsibility, men who refuse to import ideologies that fragment what we need to integrate. You are that someone, and it is time. The work continues beyond these pages. The lattice will hold for now. In time, it will be surpassed. And that is the way of all things honest. Until next time.